In the summer of 1944, an invisible threat began falling from the skies over London with such devastating precision that no known defense could stop it. Within weeks, one American invention would turn the tide of this terror campaign and save thousands of lives, yet its name remains nearly forgotten today. This is the story of the weapon that taught artillery shells to think. The morning of June 13, 1944, should have been a moment of celebration across Britain. Just 1 week earlier, Allied forces had stormed the beaches of Normandy, finally opening the long-awaited Second Front against Nazi Germany. The liberation of Europe had begun. Victory, though still distant, now seemed inevitable. Yet as dawn broke over the English Channel that Tuesday morning, a new nightmare was about to descend upon London, one that would challenge everything military planners thought they understood about air defense. At precisely 4 minutes past 4 in the morning, residents of the London borough of Bethnal Green were jolted awake by an explosion unlike any they had experienced during 5 years of war. The blast tore through a railway bridge on Grove Road, killing 6 people instantly and injuring 9 others. Within minutes, reports began flooding into military headquarters of a strange new weapon. Witnesses described a small aircraft, pilotless and spewing flames from its tail, racing across the sky with a distinctive mechanical buzzing sound before its engine cut out, and it plunged earthward. The age of the robot bomb had arrived. The weapon was the WWII, or Vengeance Weapon 1, though it would become infamous simply as the V-1 flying bomb. The British public quickly gave it a more visceral nickname, the Doodlebug, after the puttering sound of its pulse jet engine. But there was nothing whimsical about the devastation it would unleash. Over the following weeks and months, thousands of these mechanical terrors would rain down on southern England, each one carrying an 1,800-pound warhead and traveling at speeds approaching 400 miles per hour. They were too small to be easily spotted, too fast to be reliably intercepted by fighter aircraft, and too numerous to be stopped by conventional means. The V-1 represented a terrifying new paradigm in warfare. Unlike a bomber, it required no crew, no training, no months of preparation. Unlike a conventional bomb, it could be launched from a simple ramp, day or night, in any weather. The Germans could produce them cheaply and in vast numbers. Each launch site along the French coast could send dozens hurtling toward London every day. The psychological impact was profound. During the Blitz of 1940 and 1941, Londoners could at least hear the approaching bombers and take shelter. They could watch the dogfights overhead and cheer when a Spitfire sent a German plane spiraling down. But the V-1 was different. It was impersonal, mechanical, unstoppable. There was no pilot to outwit, no formation to break up, no morale to shatter. The Doodlebug simply came, buzzing its way across the channel with mindless determination. British air defenses mobilized immediately, but they faced a problem that seemed mathematically insurmountable. Fighter aircraft could intercept some of the flying bombs, but only in perfect conditions and at great risk. Pilots had to dive on the V-1s at tremendous speed, match their velocity, and either shoot them down over unpopulated areas or use their wing tips to flip the gyroscopes and send them off course. It was dangerous, exhausting work, and it could only stop a fraction of the incoming weapons. The real solution, military planners knew, had to come from anti-aircraft artillery. Massive batteries of guns were rushed to the south coast, forming a great steel curtain between the launch sites and London. Thousands of shells were fired into the sky each day, filling the air with explosive bursts of shrapnel. Yet the success rate remained abysmal. The fundamental problem was one of geometry and probability. A traditional anti-aircraft shell was essentially a flying grenade. When fired, A mechanical timer inside the shell would count down based on the gunner's calculations of range, altitude, and speed. At the predetermined moment, the shell would explode, sending fragments of hot metal slicing through the air. If an enemy aircraft happened to be within the lethal radius at that precise instant, it would be destroyed. But the chances of such perfect timing were vanishingly small. Gunners were trying to predict where a small, fast-moving target would be several seconds in the future, then launch a projectile to arrive at that exact spot at the exact instant the timer ran out. They were attempting to thread a needle while riding a galloping horse in the dark. The mathematics were cruel. A bomber flying at 200 miles per hour would cover nearly 300 feet every second. An error of just half a second in the timer setting meant the shell would explode 300 feet away from the target, far beyond the lethal radius of the fragments. The V-1, traveling twice as fast, made the problem even worse. Even the most skilled gun crews, using the most advanced mechanical predictors and the most precise timer fuses, could only achieve hit rates of around 20 to 25% against the flying bombs. For every 4 V-1s that approached the gun line, 3 would get through. London was being pummeled day and night, and there seemed to be no solution. What the gunners needed was impossible. They needed a shell that could decide for itself when to explode. They needed a projectile that could sense when it was near a target and detonate at exactly the right moment, without human intervention, without a preset timer, without any knowledge of range or altitude or speed. They needed, in essence, a thinking bullet. And in the summer of 1944, as the V-1s rained down on Britain, such a weapon did not merely sound improbable. It sounded like pure fantasy. Yet unknown to the British gunners firing desperately into the skies above the English Channel, and unknown to the German engineers perfecting their vengeance weapons, that impossible dream had already been realized. In the most secretive weapons program of the entire war, a program so classified that it rivaled the Manhattan Project in its security measures, American and British scientists had achieved what many thought was technically impossible. They had built a miniature radar system small enough to fit inside an artillery shell, rugged enough to survive the devastating forces of firing, and reliable enough to detonate at precisely the right distance from an enemy aircraft. They called it the variable time fuse, a deliberately bland name chosen to conceal its true function. But it would become known to history by a more descriptive term, the proximity fuse. The story of the proximity fuse begins not in the crucible of war, but in the quiet laboratories of peacetime science. Throughout the 1930s, physicists and engineers had understood the theoretical possibility of using radio waves to detect distant objects. Radar technology was advancing rapidly in Britain, Germany, and the United States, proving invaluable for spotting incoming bombers while they were still miles away. But detecting a large aircraft from a ground station was one thing. Building a detection system small enough to fit inside a 5-inch artillery shell, one that would be subjected to forces exceeding 20,000 times the force of gravity during firing, one that had to function for only a few seconds, but had to function perfectly during those seconds, one that needed to be manufactured by the millions at reasonable cost, was an entirely different proposition. Most engineers who examined the problem concluded it was unsolvable. The components required for a radio transmitter and receiver were simply too large and too fragile to survive being fired from a gun. The vacuum tubes that formed the heart of any radio circuit would shatter instantly under the acceleration forces. The delicate adjustments needed to tune a radio frequency would be knocked out of alignment before the shell even left the barrel. The power supply would fail, the antenna would break, the entire system would be reduced to rattling junk before it had traveled 10 feet. Building a proximity fuse, the skeptics argued, was like trying to build a wristwatch that could survive being hit with a sledgehammer and still keep perfect time. But one man refused to accept these limitations. Merle Tuve was a physicist of exceptional brilliance and even more exceptional stubbornness. Born in South Dakota in 1900, Tuve had spent his career pushing the boundaries of experimental physics, helping to develop early radar systems and pioneering the use of radio waves to probe the ionosphere. When war broke out in Europe, Tuve was serving as the director of the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism at the Carnegie Institution in Washington. He was not a military man. He had no experience with artillery or munitions. But he understood radio waves, he understood electronics, and he understood that conventional approaches to air defense were failing catastrophically. In the summer of 1940, as Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany and the Luftwaffe prepared to launch the Battle of Britain, Tuve received a visit from British scientists who had crossed the Atlantic to share their most advanced military secrets. Among the technologies they revealed was the cavity magnetron, a revolutionary device that could generate powerful microwave signals, making compact radar systems practical for the first time. The British were desperate for American help in developing new weapons and new defenses. The two nations, though not yet formal allies, understood that their survival might depend on scientific cooperation. Tuve listened carefully to what the British delegation had to say about their air defense challenges, and he began to think about shells that could sense their targets. The National Defense Research Committee, a newly formed organization tasked with mobilizing American science for military purposes, gave Tuve permission to investigate the possibility of a proximity fuse. He was allocated a small budget, a handful of researchers, and a cramped laboratory space. What he was not given was any expectation of success. The project was considered a long shot, an interesting research exercise that might yield useful data even if it never produced a working weapon. Tuve and his team were essentially told to try the impossible and see what happened. They began by discarding conventional wisdom. If existing vacuum tubes were too fragile to survive gun firing, they would design new tubes specifically for that purpose. If standard electronic components could not handle the shock, they would invent components that could. If the laws of physics said miniaturization was impossible, they would rewrite the engineering rules until it became possible. Tuve assembled a team of physicists, engineers, and technicians who shared his refusal to accept limitations. Together, they began the grinding work of turning theory into reality. The technical challenges were staggering. The fuse had to fit within the nose cone of a standard 5-inch anti-aircraft shell, leaving room for a package barely 4 inches in diameter and 6 inches long. Inside that tiny space, the designers had to fit a radio transmitter, a radio receiver, an antenna, a power supply, an amplification circuit, a detonation trigger, and all the necessary wiring and structural support. Every component had to be miniaturized to an extreme degree. Every connection had to be shock-resistant. Every tube had to be specially reinforced. The tolerances were measured in thousandths of an inch. A single loose wire, a single cracked solder joint, a single misaligned component would cause the entire system to fail. The power supply problem alone seemed insurmountable. The fuse needed electricity to operate its radio circuits, but batteries were too heavy and too unreliable. The solution came from an unexpected source. The designers developed a tiny electrical generator powered by the spin of the shell itself. As the shell rotated in flight, a small turbine or magnetic system would generate just enough current to power the electronics for the few seconds they needed to function. It was an elegant solution born of desperate necessity. Then there was the problem of the vacuum tubes. Standard radio tubes, with their delicate glass envelopes and fine wire filaments, would never survive the brutal acceleration of gun firing. Tuve's team worked with manufacturers to develop miniature tubes with reinforced structures, thicker filaments, and shock-absorbing mounts. Each tube had to be tested by being fired from a gun, recovered, and examined to see what had broken. The failures were legion. Tubes shattered, filaments snapped, envelopes cracked. But gradually, through hundreds of iterations and thousands of test firings, the team developed tubes that could survive. They were not elegant, they were not cheap, but they worked. The radio system itself had to operate on a knife edge of sensitivity. The transmitter needed to send out a continuous signal strong enough to bounce off an aircraft hundreds of feet away, but not so strong that it drained the limited power supply. The receiver needed to detect the faint reflected signal against a background of noise and interference, then trigger the detonation circuit at precisely the right moment. The entire sequence, from detecting the reflection to firing the detonator, had to happen in a fraction of a second. Too early, and the shell would explode harmlessly in empty air. Too late, and it would pass the target without detonating. Secrecy surrounding the project was absolute. Workers who assembled the fuses were told they were building ordinary timer mechanisms. Security officers confiscated any fuse that failed to detonate during testing, ensuring that no intact examples could fall into enemy hands. Even the name was deliberately misleading. The device was called the variable time fuse, suggesting it was merely an improved timer, when in fact it represented a revolutionary leap in weapons technology. Documents referred to it by code names and bureaucratic designations. Researchers were forbidden from discussing their work outside of secure facilities. The proximity fuse was treated as one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war, on par with the atomic bomb program itself. By late 1942, Tuve's team had working prototypes. Early tests were promising but revealed countless problems. Some fuses detonated prematurely. Others failed to detonate at all. Some were too sensitive, exploding at the slightest radio interference. Others were not sensitive enough, sailing past their targets without triggering. Each failure was analyzed, each problem addressed, each design refined. The testing process was relentless. Fuses were fired at drone aircraft, at sleeves towed behind planes, at mock-ups mounted on poles. They were tested in rain, in snow, in fog, in bright sunlight. They were tested over land and over water. Every environmental condition that might affect performance was methodically explored. The breakthrough came in the Pacific Theater. By early 1943, proximity-fused shells were being supplied to the United States Navy for use against Japanese aircraft. The results were spectacular. Ships that had struggled to defend themselves against air attack suddenly became deadly. Gunners no longer needed to calculate precise range and timing. They simply had to get the shell close to the target, and the fuse would do the rest. The first confirmed kill using a proximity fuse came in January 1943, when the cruiser Helena shot down a Japanese bomber in the Solomon Islands. The shell exploded 20 feet from the aircraft, shredding it with fragments. Within months, proximity fuses were standard equipment on American warships throughout the Pacific. But the weapon remained too secret to use over land, where duds might be recovered by the enemy and reverse-engineered. Throughout 1943 and into early 1944, the proximity fuse was restricted to naval use over open water, where any unexploded rounds would sink harmlessly to the ocean floor. Allied commanders pleaded for permission to use the weapon against the growing threat of German air attack in Europe, but the risk of compromise was considered too great. The secret had to be protected at all costs. Then came the V-1s and the calculus changed. By late June 1944, thousands of flying bombs had struck Britain, killing over 2,000 civilians and injuring thousands more. The attacks were intensifying and conventional defenses were proving inadequate. The strategic situation was becoming desperate. If the V-1 campaign continued unchecked, it could undermine civilian morale, disrupt war production, and potentially delay the Allied advance across France. Something had to be done. On June 28, just 2 weeks after the first V-1 attack, a secret conference was held in London. Senior Allied commanders, scientists, and air defense experts gathered to address the crisis. The evidence was clear. Traditional timer fuses were simply not effective enough against the small, fast-moving flying bombs. Fighter interception helped, but could not stop the majority of launches. The gun line was firing thousands of rounds per day with minimal results. After intense debate, the decision was made. The proximity fuse would be released for use over land against the V-1 threat. The risk of compromise was accepted as necessary. The first proximity fused shells were rushed to the anti-aircraft batteries, defending the southern approaches to London. Gunners were given minimal information about the new ammunition. They were simply told to load and fire as usual, and that the new fuses would improve accuracy. They were ordered to report every single dud so that recovery teams could retrieve the sensitive mechanisms before enemy agents could find them. The gunners did not know they were using the most advanced weapons technology in the world. They just knew that suddenly, inexplicably, they were hitting their targets. The impact was immediate and dramatic. Within the first week of using proximity fuses, interception rates against V-1s began to climb. Shells that would have exploded uselessly in empty air with timer fuses were now detonating within lethal range of their targets. The flying bombs, which had seemed nearly invincible, began falling from the sky in unprecedented numbers. Gunners who had grown accustomed to watching helplessly as Doodlebugs droned past their positions now saw them disintegrate in midair, torn apart by shells that seemed to know exactly when to explode. By mid-August, the statistics told an astonishing story. Before the introduction of proximity fuses, anti-aircraft guns were destroying approximately 24% of the V-1s that came within range. After proximity fuses were deployed, that number leaped to over 79%. In some batteries, using optimal tactics and the newest fuses, success rates exceeded 85%. The transformation was nothing short of miraculous. The gun line that had been a costly failure was now an impenetrable barrier. The V-1 threat, which had terrorized London for weeks, was effectively neutralized. The Germans noticed the change immediately but could not understand what had happened. Intelligence reports from agents in Britain confirmed that Allied anti-aircraft effectiveness had suddenly and inexplicably improved. Luftwaffe reconnaissance flights observed the increased number of V-1s being destroyed before reaching their targets. German scientists and military analysts struggled to explain the phenomenon. Some theorized that the British had developed new aiming computers. Others suggested improved radar guidance for the gun batteries. A few captured shell fragments hinted at strange electronic components, but without an intact fuse to examine, German engineers could not determine what they were looking at. In August 1944, German forces finally recovered an intact proximity-fused shell that had failed to detonate. The device was rushed to technical intelligence facilities for analysis. What the German scientists found astonished and dismayed them. The shell contained a complete miniature radio transmitter and receiver, more advanced than anything German engineers had attempted to build. The vacuum tubes were of a design unknown to German industry. The level of miniaturization exceeded what German experts had believed possible. Most troubling of all, The fuse appeared to be mass-produced with precision manufacturing techniques that suggested the Allies had thousands or even millions of these weapons in their arsenal. German attempts to replicate the technology went nowhere. The Reich was running short on raw materials, manufacturing capacity, and skilled researchers. Resources were being poured into jet aircraft, rockets, and other wonder weapons that Hitler believed would turn the tide of the war. The proximity fuse was studied, admired, and filed away as yet another example of Allied industrial and scientific superiority. No serious effort was made to copy it. By the time the Germans understood what they were facing, it was far too late to respond. The impact of the proximity fuse extended far beyond the V-1 campaign. In the Pacific, American ships equipped with proximity-fused ammunition were proving devastatingly effective against Japanese kamikaze attacks. The suicidal pilots, who had terrorized Allied naval forces with their willingness to crash bomb-laden aircraft into ships, found that they could no longer get close enough to their targets. Proximity-fused shells created a lethal bubble around defending ships, detonating near enough to destroy incoming aircraft before they could complete their suicide runs. What had been a terrifying and often effective tactic became a death sentence with little chance of success. In ground combat, the proximity fuse revolutionized artillery tactics. Traditional artillery achieved its killing effect either through direct hits or through fragments from shells that burst upon striking the ground. But a proximity fuse could be set to detonate several feet above the ground, creating an air burst that showered fragments downward over a much wider area. Soldiers in foxholes and trenches, who were relatively safe from ground bursts, found themselves hideously vulnerable to shells that exploded overhead. There was nowhere to hide from an air burst. The fragments came from above, penetrating helmets and striking exposed flesh. The psychological effect was devastating. The true lethality of proximity-fused artillery became evident during the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944. When German forces launched their surprise offensive through the Ardennes forest, they initially achieved significant gains against unprepared American units. But as the battle developed and American artillery began to concentrate against the German advance, the proximity fuse turned the tide. Artillery batteries equipped with the new fuses laid down air burst barrages that decimated German infantry and gun crews in the open. Advancing troops who had survived the initial artillery fire found themselves caught in a killing zone, where every shell seemed to explode at exactly the wrong moment. German officers reported entire units being shredded by overhead bursts against which there was no defense. The offensive ground to a halt, and the German army in the West never recovered. Japanese forces encountered proximity-fused artillery during the final campaigns in the Pacific and found it equally terrifying. Japanese infantry tactics relied heavily on massed assaults and concealed defensive positions. Proximity-fused shells defeated both approaches. Air bursts cleared bunkers and fortified positions that ground bursts could not reach. Massed troops in the open were cut down with horrifying efficiency. Japanese commanders reported that American artillery had become impossibly accurate and impossibly deadly, not understanding that the shells themselves were making the targeting decisions. Throughout the final year of the war, proximity fuses became standard equipment across all Allied forces. Over 22 million rounds were produced and fired in combat. The numbers are staggering in their scale. 22 million miniature radar systems, each one a marvel of engineering, each one manufactured to exacting tolerances, each one capable of making the split-second decision that meant the difference between a wasted shot and a kill. The industrial achievement alone was remarkable. The military impact was incalculable. Yet for all its success, the proximity fuse remained one of the least celebrated weapons of the war. The atomic bomb, which ended the conflict with 2 devastating strikes, became instantly famous. Radar, which helped win the Battle of Britain, was widely recognized and discussed. Code-breaking efforts at Bletchley Park eventually became public knowledge and celebrated in books and films. But the proximity fuse, which saved countless Allied lives and fundamentally changed the nature of air defense and artillery, remained classified for years after the war ended. When the secret was finally revealed, it generated brief interest and then faded into obscurity, known primarily to military historians and weapons specialists. The reasons for this obscurity are worth examining. Unlike the atomic bomb, the proximity fuse did not end the war with a single dramatic blow. Unlike radar, it was not a technology that civilians could easily understand or visualize. Unlike code-breaking, it did not produce dramatic intelligence coups or clear turning points. The proximity fuse simply made existing weapons more effective. It increased hit rates, reduced ammunition consumption, and saved lives through incremental improvement rather than revolutionary transformation. It was a quiet miracle, and quiet miracles are easy to forget. Yet the significance of the proximity fuse extends beyond its immediate military applications. It represented a fundamental shift in how weapons could function. For thousands of years, from the first thrown spear to the most advanced artillery piece, projectile weapons had been essentially dumb objects. They followed ballistic trajectories determined by the initial conditions of their launch. They struck where physics dictated they would strike. They exploded when a timer ran out or when they hit something solid. Human skill and judgment determined when and where to fire, but once the weapon was released, it was beyond human control. The proximity fuse changed that equation. For the first time in history, a projectile could make decisions in flight. It could sense its environment, evaluate conditions, and take action based on what it detected. The weapon had been given a primitive form of autonomy. This was not artificial intelligence in the modern sense, but it was a step in that direction. The proximity fuse was the ancestor of every smart weapon, every guided missile, every autonomous system that would follow in the decades after the war. It proved that machines could be trusted with lethal decisions, and it opened the door to a future where human judgment would be increasingly supplemented or replaced by automated systems. The philosophical implications troubled some of the scientists who worked on the project. They had created a weapon that killed more efficiently, and efficiency in killing is a morally ambiguous achievement. Merle Tuve himself struggled with the legacy of his invention. After the war, he returned to pure scientific research, focusing on astronomy and geophysics, fields where his work would expand human knowledge rather than human capacity for destruction. He rarely spoke publicly about the proximity fuse, and when he did, his tone was often conflicted. He was proud of the technical achievement and believed the weapon had saved Allied lives by shortening the war and improving defensive capabilities. But he was also aware that he had helped create a new category of weapons technology, one whose descendants would become increasingly sophisticated and increasingly troubling. The proximity fuse also illuminated a broader truth about military innovation. The decisive weapons of war are not always the most powerful or the most dramatic. Sometimes, the weapon that changes everything is the one that solves a specific problem with elegant efficiency. The atomic bomb could destroy a city, but the proximity fuse could protect one. The bomb ended the war, but the fuse helped win it. The bomb was a weapon of terror and last resort, but the fuse was a weapon of precision and persistent effectiveness. History remembers the spectacular, but wars are often won by the mundane. German failure to develop a comparable weapon reveals much about the nature of technological competition during the war. Germany possessed brilliant scientists, sophisticated laboratories, and a strong tradition of engineering excellence. German researchers understood radio technology, radar principles, and miniaturization challenges as well as their Allied counterparts. In theory, Germany could have developed a proximity fuse. In practice, they never came close. The reasons for this failure are instructive. First, German military research was fragmented and competitive. Different branches of the armed forces pursued separate development programs with minimal coordination. Resources were duplicated, results were hoarded, and promising research directions were often abandoned due to inter-service rivalry. The proximity fuse required sustained collaboration between physicists, engineers, and military users. The Allied research environment, particularly in the United States, fostered such collaboration. The German system actively discouraged it. Second, German strategy prioritized offensive wonder weapons over defensive improvements. Hitler and his senior commanders believed that the war would be won by jets, rockets, and super-heavy tanks that could smash through enemy lines. Defensive weapons that merely improved the effectiveness of existing systems held little appeal. The proximity fuse was precisely the kind of incremental but vital improvement that German military culture undervalued. Allied researchers, working within a strategic framework that emphasized protection of cities and fleets, saw air defense as a critical priority. German researchers, working within a framework that emphasized blitzkrieg and offensive action, devoted their efforts elsewhere. Third, German industrial capacity was increasingly strained by strategic bombing and resource shortages. Building proximity fuses required precision manufacturing, specialized components, and quality control systems that could produce millions of units to exacting standards. By 1944, German industry was struggling to produce enough basic ammunition, fuel, and spare parts to keep its forces supplied. Diverting resources to develop an entirely new fuse technology was simply not feasible, even if the military value had been recognized. Finally, there was the element of conceptual blindness. German analysts who examined captured proximity fuses were astonished by the level of miniaturization and the manufacturing quality, but they fundamentally misunderstood the strategic implications. They saw the fuse as an interesting technical achievement, but not as a war-winning weapon. They failed to grasp how dramatically improved air defense would affect the broader course of the war. This failure of imagination was not unique to Germany. Military establishments throughout history have often failed to recognize the significance of new technologies until those technologies had already decided the outcome of battles. The proximity fuse stands as a monument to a particular kind of scientific achievement. It was not the product of a single genius having a brilliant insight. It was the result of systematic problem-solving by teams of researchers who refused to accept that a challenge was impossible. Merle Tuve and his colleague did not invent any fundamentally new physics. They did not discover previously unknown principles. What they did was engineering in its purest form. They took existing knowledge, existing components, and existing manufacturing techniques, and they combined them in new ways to solve a specific problem. The innovation was not in the science, but in the application. This distinction matters because it highlights a truth about technological progress. Breakthroughs often come not from theoretical advances, but from practical determination. The proximity fuse worked because engineers were willing to test thousands of designs, because manufacturers were willing to retool their production lines, because military leaders were willing to trust an unproven technology, and because scientists were willing to admit when their initial assumptions were wrong. The weapon succeeded through iteration, collaboration, and relentless commitment to making the impossible merely difficult, and then making the difficult routine. In the final accounting, the proximity fuse saved lives on a scale that is difficult to quantify but impossible to ignore. Every V-1 shot down before reaching London meant families that did not die in their homes. Every kamikaze plane destroyed before striking its target meant sailors who survived to return home. Every air-burst artillery shell that dispersed attacking troops meant fewer casualties on both sides as battles were decided more quickly. The weapon killed, as all weapons do, but it killed in service of protection and in service of ending a catastrophic conflict more rapidly. The moral calculus of such technology is never simple, but in the context of total war against fascist aggression, the proximity fuse stands as one of the more defensible innovations of a terrible era. The story of the proximity fuse is ultimately a story about asking the right question. For decades, artillery designers had asked how to build better guns, more powerful shells, more accurate aiming systems. They asked how to make gunners faster and calculations more precise. But Merle Tuve and his team asked a different question. They asked what would happen if the shell itself could decide when to explode. They asked whether a near miss could be turned into a hit through technological means. They asked if thinking could be offloaded from human operators to the weapons themselves. These questions led to answers that changed warfare. Today, in an era of GPS-guided bombs, autonomous drones, and artificial intelligence in military systems, the proximity fuse seems almost quaint. A simple radio transmitter that detonates a shell when it detects a reflection is primitive compared to weapons that can identify targets, select attack profiles, and execute complex missions with minimal human oversight. But every smart weapon, every guided missile, every autonomous system carries within it the legacy of that first thinking shell. The proximity fuse proved that machines could be trusted with tactical decisions in combat. It demonstrated that automation could enhance rather than replace human judgment. It showed that the future of warfare would belong not to bigger guns, but to smarter ones. The engineers and scientists who built the proximity fuse could not have imagined the world their invention would help create. They were focused on stopping V-1s and protecting ships from air attack. They were trying to win a war, not spark a revolution in military technology. Yet their work opened a door that can never be closed. We now live in a world where weapons think, where machines make kill decisions, where human operators are increasingly removed from the lethal end of the military chain. Whether this represents progress or peril remains an open question, but it began with a shell that knew when to explode. If this story of forgotten genius and secret weapons has captivated you, please consider subscribing to this channel for more deep dives into the hidden history of World War II and the innovations that shaped our modern world. If you found this narrative compelling, a like helps ensure more people discover these remarkable stories. And here is a question to spark discussion in the comments. Knowing what you know now about the proximity fuse and its descendants, do you believe the development of autonomous weapons technology has made warfare more humane by reducing collateral damage, or more dangerous by removing human judgment from life and death decisions? Share your thoughts below.